My name is Gavin, and I'm a 16-year-old boy. Life was pretty normal for my family. We lived in a nice neighborhood that was getting ready for Halloween. People carved pumpkins and put out spooky decorations. It was my favorite time of the year. Then, on October 31st, came an emergency broadcast across the TV that morning. It hasn't stopped playing since. It went something like this. The president has declared a state of national emergency. All citizens are advised to shelter in their homes from sunset to sunrise on October 31st, Halloween night. Be prepared with whatever supplies necessary to stay in your home all night. It is advisable to keep a firearm near if you have one. Do not go outdoors. Shelter in the central part of your home away from all the windows. This message played on a loop on the TV and was broadcasted on our phones occasionally. I was asleep, blissfully unaware of the panic the town had been cast into. My father woke me, telling me we were going to make a run to the store for some things we would need. He left my bedroom without explanation, but I could tell something was wrong with him. I got dressed quickly and ran downstairs, where I saw the broadcast blaring on the TV. Fear percolated in my chest. Why did we have to shelter inside? And why did they want us to be armed? My father had a hunting rifle, but I've only seen him take it out once. "Kids, let's go," Mother yelled. My family loaded into the car, in a somewhat state of shock. Well, at least I was in shock. My younger brother and sister were old enough to understand what was going on, but not really old enough to care. My anxiety reached its peak when we made it into town. People had gone mad. Shoppers raced to empty shelves of whatever canned goods and water they could find. By the time we had made it to the store, it was mostly barren. We were able to get some food and water items that were less desirable, like microwave dinners. The masses seemed focused on the non-perishable. On the way home, my father stopped at a small gun store. It was too overran, but after almost an hour, my dad came out with a small black box. By the time we made it home, it was late in the afternoon. The neighborhood had been transformed. It more resembled something out of the movies than the place that I had grown up. Many of the houses had boards across the windows, and people scurried about taking supplies into their homes. My family unloaded from the van as my mother rushed us all inside. The TV still played that broadcast on repeat. As it played, I gave it some more thought. What did everyone think was going to happen? All this panic, and no one had identified a threat. We simply feared because we were told to be afraid. I was starting to think the whole thing was one elaborate prank. My parents didn't look like they felt the same, however. My mother was preparing for an emergency like a coming hurricane, filling all the sinks and bathtubs with water, while my dad boarded up as many windows as possible with what little wood he could scrounge up. It was crazy how fast everything had changed. Just a few hours before, I was resting peacefully in my bed. Everyone kept up at this pace. Meanwhile, I was supposed to be watching my siblings. The afternoon faded to evening, and with it came the unsettling quiet. The neighborhood had fallen silent. Darkness fell upon everything as the last wisps of sunlight spilled over rooftops. Shadows began to crawl across yards and up and down the street. Everyone was hiding in their homes, and from what? Decorations still hung where they were supposed to celebrate Halloween. Instead, they made this scene seem more sinister, as the skeletons lay on the lawns while the ghosts swayed in the trees. My parents had made us retreat upstairs, where they stashed all of our supplies for the night. I peered out of my window as darkness slowly engulfed everything. It was an abnormally dark night, and few lights remained on, creating pools of light that stood like islands in the inky black sea of night. Suddenly, I saw movement down the street. And at first, I wasn't certain I'd seen anything at all. Then, more movement. Something was definitely on the road, but what? And I kept watch from my second-story vantage point, and it was coming closer, seeming to make its way towards the cul-de-sac where my house stood. And I couldn't see it well in the darkness, but one of the houses it was nearing had a floodlight on over the garage. The light mostly died out in the driveway, notably not as illuminating as it usually seemed. Or was I just crazy? But enough light spilled into the street that I could certainly see a figure moving now. And it was low to the ground, like it was moving on all four limbs. And I say limbs because it didn't even have a remotely human shape. And could it be a dog? And it passed the dim rays of light and returned to an ocean of black. And I lost sight of the thing, and I tried to tell myself it was probably just a dog, but it didn't look quite right. I couldn't be certain, but for a second, I could swear I had seen its legs bent in irregular directions like that of an arachnid. And also, it didn't have that little trot that dogs do. Instead, it moved slowly, with great deliberation, crawling across the landscape. And as I gazed out of my window and watched the sparse pools of light, I noticed a thick fog settling over everything. Minutes flew past as I watched the fog choke out the remaining light cast from the occasional light post. And I looked out in horror as my neighborhood was completely obstructed from sight. I ran to my parents' room where I rambled about the fog and some weird creature. My father had his rifle leaning against the wall, apparently loaded. He looked nervous, as did my mother. And just then, we heard something. A subtle scratching from downstairs. My mother gathered up the kids as my father went to investigate. He made his way down the stairs, just approaching the bottom when the house was plunged into darkness. And everyone shrieked, and my mom yelled at my dad to come back. "I'm fine," he said in response as he flicked on his phone for light. "I don't have any service though, do you?" "No," my mother responded. "I'm going to see if the neighbors have power," he said as he peeled back the curtains of one of the windows that didn't have a board completely covering it. "The whole neighborhood is out, even the light poles," was the last thing my father ever said to me. And at that moment, two arms burst through the glass and wood. And I use the word arms loosely as they weren't human. Pitch black limbs wrapped around my father, and as a short scream leapt his chest. He didn't have time for much else. The limbs had multiple joints and seemed to bend in impossible directions. And slowly my dad was ripped out the window right in front of me. And I wish it had happened like in the movies where they were just seemingly sucked out of a window. My father was not so lucky. You see, the window didn't fully break, so when he was drug out, his abdomen, arms, and legs got caught on jagged pieces of glass that acted like razor blades as he was pulled out of the window over the course of an eternity. And I stood there in horror and disbelief. The sight was so painful my brain couldn't even process it all at once. My mind was reeling, already making up alternative explanations for what I just witnessed. A bad dream, a psychotic break. Anything not to accept what I just saw. My mother grabbed me by my arm and yanked me into her bedroom. My siblings were crying, but even in my dazed state, I knew they were shielded from what had happened. Unable to see the pool of blood in front of the window or the chunks of flesh that still clung to the jagged glass. My mom slammed shut the door, and she did her best to get the kids to be quiet. I wish she had done a better job. Before long, we could hear something downstairs. And I say something because it didn't sound like the footsteps of any creature I've heard before. Whatever was in the house, it was heavy, and it moved slowly about downstairs. And it was searching from one room to the next, and finally made its way to the staircase. And one painfully loud step at a time, we listened in horror as it made its ascent. Whatever it was, might not have been bipedal, but it was just so hard to tell by listening. And without hesitation, it crept to the bedroom door, and silence fell as it stood on the other side. I didn't know what to expect. A growl, a snort as it smelled the air, even it slamming its body weight into the door and trying to break it down. What I didn't expect was to hear my father's voice say, "Open the door, honey. I just want to see the kids."